Nice full house today on election day. Thank you for coming. The polls are closed, and all I can say is the election results are in, and I know that our speaker for the evening, the winner is Princeton University senior lecturer Michael Cadden. He is chair of the Princeton University Peter V. Lewis Center for the Arts. And that is an academic unit at Princeton made up of programs in creative writing, dance, theater, the visual arts, and the Princeton Atelier. The Lewis Center, by the way, has been designed to put the creative and performing arts at the center, the heart of the Princeton experience. Michael Cadden, although maybe he's 25 years old, is in his 30th year of teaching at Princeton. And for 19 of those years, he served as director of the program in theater, which was formerly known as the program in theater and dance. In 2003, he helped launch the Roger Berlin Theater, which was 10 years in the planning and the so-called jewel in the crown of Princeton's performing arts community. His areas of interest include modern and contemporary theater, Shakespeare in performance, and Australian literature and theater. In 1993, he received Princeton's Presidential Award for Distinguished Teaching, and before he came to Princeton, he began at that other school called Yale, the Yale School of Drama. And since I know you will want to hear more of Michael Cadden's wisdom, I'm pleased to report that he will moderate a future Princeton Adult School event on March 2nd, 2014. It's one of the conversations among some renowned people, whom I don't know who they are, but we'll find out. But Michael will be moderating, and the topic will be, of course, the arts. I just want to conclude by saying none of this verbiage about his extraordinary professional accomplishments refers to the one accomplishment that is most noteworthy to me, and I've known him for many years, and that is his irrepressible joyfulness, kindness, and generosity of spirit, and I mean that. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the real winner, Michael Cadden.
I'll happily accept if Governor Christie will step aside. So actually, I thought that the thing that I was going to be complimented on was, as my most sterling achievement, was the fact that when I first came to Princeton, this would be well over 25 years ago now, I actually taught a course at the Princeton Adult School. And so I was particularly delighted to get this invitation. I've done a lecture now and again for other people who were doing courses, but it must have only been in my second or third year, it seems to me, that I offered that course and had a good time doing it and meeting people from the community outside of sort of the academic world that I normally travel in. Tonight, I'll actually be talking about the work of Samuel Beckett, and particularly Beckett's 1953 play, Waiting for Godot. Some of you will know that the brief that the adult school sort of gave the speakers in this series was to pick something from the past 75 years that transformed their area of study or the wider world as we know it. And yeah, it's funny, since I declared that I would be talking about Beckett, I've had a lot of other thoughts about other things that I might actually want to talk about. But this was the first thing out of my mouth, or at any rate, sort of onto the computer, and for reasons that you might get some sense of, as I go along. Almost since its premiere 60 years ago, right, sort of it premiered in France in January of 1953, Waiting for Godot has been identified as a game changer in the theater. Right, and so basically, people who make theater think, at least to some degree, in terms of pre-Godot and post-Godot, right? In a way that we sort of, also think about Ibsen's A Dollhouse, for example. The Dollhouse very regularly treated as the first modern drama. Right? Now, there are lots of arguments that can be made about these milestones in the history of any art. But clearly something happened with the Dollhouse that people hadn't quite seen before. Something happened with Godot that proved to be represent a paradigm shift. I think your next speaker will be talking about the whole history of the phrase paradigm shift. I'll be serious about that. Thomas Kuhn. At any rate, so sort of Beckett's Godot really had quite an impact in Paris in '53. In London, when it was done in 1955, directed at the Arts Theatre by Peter Hall, who at the time was, I think, a 24-year-old young director fresh out of Cambridge, who had no idea what the play was about, but it was a gig, and so he was going to do it, so he's done it, I think, 5 times since. He's produced versions of it. He says, I continue to want to expiate the sin of that first production. At any rate, he went on to, of course, run the Royal Shakespeare Company and the Royal National Theatre. Right? So this turns out to have been a good place to start his career. And as you may know, in the United States, Godot has had its first appearance at the Coconut Grove Playhouse in Miami, Florida. Right, where it was billed as the laugh riot of 2 continents. Now, actually, the story that goes with this production is that it was a disaster there, and this proves not to be the case. In fact, almost every performance was sold out, the reviews were good, it somehow became part of the legend that it hadn't done well there, at least in part, perhaps, because the venue might have not been the perfect choice. But at any rate, it opened later in New York, and both in Florida and in New York, it starred Burt Lahr in the role of Go-Go. You'll recall him as the Cowardly Lion in the Wizard of Oz movie. John Lahr, his son, is now the theater critic of the New Yorker magazine, and has written a wonderful biography of his father, in which he talks about going backstage to talk to his dad while he was in this run of Godot in New York. And his father said, they tell me this is a terribly intellectual play, and I guess I must not understand what it's about, because frankly, I'm doing what I've done all my life. I'm playing second banana. Right? And that's a specific role within vaudeville. Right? And it was the vaudevillian tradition that Beckett was indeed alluding to in his creation of Didi and Didi and Go-Go. So you get some sense of the impact that the play had on some of its first viewers from the handout that has the biography on one side and among Godot's reviewers on the other. In France, in relation to that 1953 production, Jean Anouilh, who would have been considered probably the best-known French playwright of his generation, right? Not much produced alas today. He's a wonderful playwright. And he wrote in his review, Godot is a masterpiece which will cause despair for men in general and for playwrights in particular. Right? So that playwrights in particular, I assume, has something to do with that feeling that the game had just changed. Right? Now something else is happening, and what's going to happen to old farts like me, and the kind of theater that we've been producing, and which has done pretty well up until now. In England, Kenneth Tynan wrote the most perceptive of the reviews of that 1955 Peter Hall production. Tynan, in fact, wrote 2 reviews. He was the leading intellectual critic, I guess, of the day. He became the literary manager for the National Theatre of Great Britain under Laurence Olivier when that was opened in 1963, a man of sort of very, very deep learning and an extraordinary understanding or knowledge of the dramatic canon. However, his leanings in theater were towards political theater. He was a great Brecht man, and Brecht was just breaking onto the English scene. And his first review of Godot was quite dismissive. And then 2 weeks later, he wrote a second review. Let me just explain that in the history of theater, this doesn't happen much. Sort of where a critic actually goes, well, on the other hand, or on second thought, right? So if you're asked to produce something quite quickly, and the fact is you might regret the thing that you produce quite quickly. That's where scholars come in to tell you where you've gone wrong. So in this instance, Tynan wrote a review and then asked his editor whether he could write another review, right? Which he did to remarkable effect. I'm going to read this out because, in fact, this is one of the more brilliant analyses of what made Beckett such a game changer, Godot specifically such a game changer. A special virtue attaches to plays which remind the drama of how much it can do without and still exist. By all the known criteria, Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot is a dramatic vacuum. Pity the critic who sees a chink in its armor, for it is all chink. It has no plot, no climax, no denouement, no beginning, no middle, and no end. Unavoidably, it has a situation, and it might be accused of having suspense, since it deals with the impatience of two tramps waiting beneath a tree for a cryptic Mr. Godot to keep his appointment with them. But the situation is never developed, and at a glance, the program shows that Mr. Godot is not going to arrive. Waiting for Godot frankly jettisons everything by which we recognize theater. It arrives at the custom house, as it were, with no luggage, no passport, and nothing to declare. Yet it gets through, as might from a pilgrim from Mars. It does this, I believe, by appealing to a definition of drama much more fundamental than any in the books. A play, it asserts and proves, is basically a means of spending 2 hours in the dark without being bored. That defines a couple of other things maybe as well. Waiting for Godot forced me to re-examine the rules which have hitherto governed the drama, and having done so, to pronounce them not elastic enough. It is validly new, and hence I declare myself, as the Spanish would say, Godotista. Now this is from 1955, and a fresh response to a new play. I once had the great privilege of asking my former colleague Alvin Kernan, who taught in the English department at Princeton for many years, whether he had seen Godot in its first New York incarnation. And indeed he had. He was a graduate student in English at Yale, with a special interest in the drama, mainly Renaissance drama, but drama tout court. And he said he went with some friends, and they came back on the train and tried to talk about the play. And he said the thing that became apparent was there was no vocabulary that we knew to talk about this play. We thought it had been great, but every critical sort of term that we had that was related to the word greatness was irrelevant to this particular play. Right? And so the question became, how do you come up with a critical vocabulary that accounts for what just happened that seems so extraordinary to you? And we've been struggling with that ever since. Vivian Mercier, an Irish critic, memorably summed up his experience of the play. Godot is a play in which nothing happens twice. Reminded me of a sort of anecdote when I first came to Princeton about a production of Waiting for Godot that was done by some undergraduates. And at the end of the first act, the actors came out and took a bow, and that was the end. And an audience member sort of went up and said, what about Act 2? And they said, well, it's so like Act 1. We just why bother? Which sort of that's deep. I think they ought to have gone on to Act 2, but still, sort of they recognize something fundamental about the play. And then finally, an homage from Tom Stoppard. And it needs to be said that Beckett is prized no more highly than he is among other playwrights. Right? So Edward Albee worships at the altar of Samuel Beckett. Sam Shepard, Carol Churchill, the British playwright, you name it. I saw a play, I've just come back from London, and saw a play on Saturday night which included bringing in two bins, as the British would say. We'd say sort of garbage cans. And there's a body that's been split between the two bins. It's been cut up and sort of in these two bins. And the fact is, I assume this is an homage to Beckett. Right? For those of you who know Endgame, there are famously two bins there, poubelle, I guess it is in French, poubelle, the parents of the lead character are actually in these two bins, and until they disappear into the bins, and it is assumed they die. Ezra Pound, when he saw the show, said very loudly at one point, "C'est moi dans le poubelle." Right? It's me in that sort of garbage tin. But sort of an extraordinarily evocative image, and a typical one, a typically strong visual image of Beckett's for, of course, the aging process. Sort of, other people can do the movie of the week version that stars Alan Alda, and sort of there's this kind of, cushy old age home or sort of whatever. Sort of Beckett said, listen, they're all garbage cans, sort of no matter what name we give them. At any rate, Stoppard, among the many people who have done homage to Beckett, writing in 1956, when Waiting for Godot was first done in Bristol, and at this time Tom Stoppard was a young journalist in Bristol. He had left school when he was 16 years old and was working as a cub reporter. In '56, when Waiting for Godot was first done in Bristol, Peter O'Toole was in the company. I was immobilized for weeks after I saw it. Historically, people had assumed that in order to have a valid theatrical event, you had to have X. Beckett did it with X minus 5, and it was immensely theatrical. He's now, this was in 1972, the interview, doing it with X minus 25. And he went on to see sort of how much he could strip away from what was thought to be necessary to drama. All the usual theatrical means were ones that he was exploring sort of the deconstruction of, sort of the removal of, to see what might actually be at the heart of the theatrical event. And again, this is what seems to me so important about Beckett. He's trying to get back to sort of what exactly theater is, what it needs. One of his more memorable plays visually includes, all you see on stage is a mouth. There's a pinpoint spot on the mouth. Some of you may have seen this at Lincoln Center when Jessica Tandy did it. And that mouth talks for about 20 minutes, and then the play is over. Beckett wrote very short plays in the last 20 years of his life. And when asked about it, Beckett said, I was trying to explore whether, in fact, the theater isn't just a mouth talking and people listening. All the rest is Ibsen. Just trying to distill the theatrical experience, exploring the theatrical experience. So lots of playwrights I've heard refer to Beckett as the theater's R&D guy. He's doing research and development in the fundamentals of what constitute the theatrical event. Beckett himself, when writing about art in general, and so he wrote about the visual arts and music sort of quite a bit. We knew about the visual arts part. The music has only come out as a result of a recent publication of his letters. He once wrote sort of this way about what it might be the contemporary project of art to do. I speak of an art turning from the feasible in disgust, weary of its puny exploits, weary of pretending to be able, of being able, of doing a little better the same old thing, of going a little further along a dreary road, preferring, for himself, the expression that there is nothing to express, nothing from which to express, no power to express, no desire to express, together with the obligation to express. And this became something of his artistic credo. There's a kind of more memorable version of it, perhaps in sort of this little statement of his from one of his pieces. Try again, fail better. Partly this aesthetic project came in response to James Joyce. And we do well to remind ourselves, maybe at this point, of some of the details and some of the facts of Beckett's own life. Beckett was, of course, an Irishman, born in 1906 of Protestant parents in a suburb of Dublin, just to the south. He was sent to the Portora School in Northern Ireland for his, we call it, high school education. This, incidentally, is the same school where Oscar Wilde sort of did his early schooling. Beckett excelled at school, particularly at sports, right? A great cricketer, good at rugby, good at boxing. Indeed, at one point, Beckett played cricket for Ireland. And Tom Stoppard said that as much as he envied Beckett his ability as a writer, he envied him more in the fact that Beckett actually appears in the great Bible of cricket. I forgot what that's called, but sort of, you know, Stoppard's a great cricket man. Every Sunday, despite the fact that they hate each other politically, Stoppard and Harold Pinter would go off and play cricket together, you know, sort of with a group of friends. At any rate, sort of, you know, Beckett, again, sort of against what you might think about the type, sort of a great sportsman, and played tennis nearly to the end of his life. So you can imagine how he might like that. Back and forth and back and forth. He first thought about an academic career. He'd sort of done very successful at university, going to Trinity College Dublin. Wrote a book on Proust, one of the first books on Proust in the English language early on. He taught French at Trinity College, specializing especially in French neoclassical drama. That would be Molière, Racine, Corneille, right, those playwrights. And then decided sort of that it was really the life of the artist that he wanted, and so wandered around Europe during the 1930s, eventually settling in Paris. During the war, he was in France, and as became known only in the 1980s, he did a little work for the resistance, for which he was awarded the Croix de Guerre and the Médaille de la Résistance. People were kind of amazed that no one knew that for 40 years, and he dismissed it as Boy Scout stuff. He said, well, what would you do? And anyone would do this in this situation. As we know, not everyone did. But the origins of Waiting for Godot, we understand to be, in part, what it was like to be in the countryside, waiting at a particular location, a crossroads as a rule, for someone to come with a message, right? And then waiting at another location to pass that message on, right? He and his wife often found themselves in that situation, right? So they were simply waiting for someone and then waiting for someone else, right? Sort of, you know, now that would be a very different play if you wrote about it sort of in the full World War II context. Sort of what Beckett did is found a way to make it a metaphor for life, for existence as a whole. In 1953, when Beckett in the late 40s wrote this great novelistic trilogy, from which I'll be quoting later, Malloy Malone Dies the Unnameable, which actually managed to get into print only because the publishing house, Edition de Minuit, was going under, and the editor decided that as long as they were going out of business, he would go out of business publishing something that he really liked, that he knew that no one would want to read. So went with Malloy. Edition de Minuit is now one of the biggest publishing houses in Paris. It's the house that Beckett built, but in fact, it didn't get the novels didn't get much of a readership. That only came in 1953. Now he's at the age of 47, sort of with the world premiere of Godot. And after 25 years of writing, so he now actually enjoys his first success. And the successes continue to come, and in some ways are capped by the winning of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969. Famously, his wife was the one who answered the phone, and when she got the news, she said, "Quelle catastrophe." What a catastrophe. Because sort of Beckett was someone who liked his privacy, and she knew that this was going to be the end of all of that. At any rate, sort of Beckett has gone on to become, say, a theatrical, literary icon, a kind of definition of a certain kind of integrity sort of in the world of the arts. Waiting for Godot, we remind ourselves, is a play that was actually written in French, which Beckett, with the help of a friend, actually translated into English. Some of Beckett's work is originally written in English, some of it's originally written in French. He is usually the person responsible for doing the translation. Sometimes he translated himself into other languages as well. And the plays all have a slightly different life depending on the language. Right? So, for example, the play I want to talk a little bit about, Waiting for Godot, in French is En attendant Godot. Right? So it would be really more accurately translated, though perhaps a little clumsily, while waiting for Godot. Right? But they went with sort of waiting for Godot. There are extremely significant lines in the English version that don't exist in the French version, or exist in some other form in the French version. There are allusions sort of in the English plays that don't exist in the French plays, where other allusions, literary and otherwise, are taking place. It's kind of an amazing, as you can imagine, amazing thing to set these plays side by side, knowing that the translator himself, the translator was the playwright himself, and he's actually just making different work, in these different languages, and the plays have entirely different feelings. The great French philosopher Alain Badiou visited a class that I was doing on Beckett with my colleague Michael Wood a couple of years ago, and we were making a point about whatever story we were reading, and he said, it's a kind of scatological joke, the thing we were talking about, and he said, oh, well, it's not there in the French. And I reminded him that, in fact, this particular story had been written originally in English, not that that meant just sort of a difference. And he said, he said, yes, I think there's an unfortunately comic side to Beckett in English. So revealing the kind of Beckett that he wanted was maybe a little different than the kind that, for example, I might actually like. But Beckett had what one might almost call a stereotypical gallows humor, right? That all the work has, gallows humor, so the humor of the gallows, right? The kind of joke that is made by members of the audience, or even perhaps the person who's being hung, but under mortal circumstances. Beckett, even one-to-one, was very given to that kind of joke. Walking down the street with Mel Gussow, the critic from the New York Times, on a beautiful autumn day in Paris, Gussow said to Beckett, Sam, this is the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive. And Beckett responded, oh, I wouldn't go so far as that. And that is, I think, typical Beckettian humor, looking to find the laugh in what ultimately thought of as the somewhat losing game that we play as mortal beings, and as we, after all, are condemned to death. I realize I'm still in the prefatory remarks here. Another reason I wanted to talk about Godot was my own association with the play. Since this is a play I first saw on television, right? And some of you may remember this production that featured Burgess Meredith and Zero Mostel, right? And it was some early version of public television. I don't think it was called that. It was like ETV, maybe, is what I called it when I lived. And it had this remarkable effect on me. My mother remembers watching it with me, and I was in hysterics. And she was a little worried. And I insisted the next day that we go out and get a copy of the play, and so I fell in love with Beckett early, and she always blamed what I do professionally on Waiting for Godot. So I feel I'm repaying a debt, since I'm one of those people who will not, in fact, regret the time that he spent in the office on his deathbed. So thanks to Sam for that. And there was yet another reason I had in mind, which is that I knew that the production, that there would be a production of Waiting for Godot, which I could send you all off to, right, at the end of this lecture, that's going on in New York right now. Some of you may have seen it in its last version, but it stars Patrick Stewart and Sir Ian McKellen. In a setting, placed in a setting very different from the one called for in the play, but the performances are very fine, and the setting is an interesting one to talk about, but I don't want to spoil it for you. I simply commend it to you, since after all, all my role would ever be is to return you to the work. That's what I want to be doing, sort of returning to the work. It's the work, the work that matters. So what was it about this play that transformed the theater as we know it? Why do I refer to this as a paradigm shift? Well, some of it has to do with what Tynan identified, sort of the stripping away of so many of the usual means of the theater, what's generally thought of as plot, what's generally thought of as exposition, what's generally thought of as a climax, sort of all those kinds of things. Character is conceived quite differently than sort of the usual thing. Even at the level of the page, you can see that something strange is happening because you're getting one-liners back and forth. Right? So sort of there might be 20 speeches on a single page. Right? As a rule in drama, before Beckett, people talk at a little greater length. Right? Beckett is trying to give you the sense of improvisation. Right? He's scripting the improvisation, but the idea is you're meant to feel like sort of what you're watching is actually sort of improvisation. And that was something that sort of one didn't see too much of. I mean, it crops up now and again from Greek tragedy on. The Greeks had a word for it, stigmathea. But something a little different in terms of what constituted dialogue than was usually the case, certainly in 1953. I'd like to suggest that what Beckett did that was especially sort of revolutionary was the way in which he reconstituted, well, that's not quite right, sort of reformulated the notion of time in the theater. And so I'm going to focus a lot on Beckett and time, because it seems to me that Beckett's great subject matter in theater, in the one film that he made, which was called Film, in his novels, in his poems, even in his criticism, sort of he's just so interested in sort of time as a subject and, of course, in the theater as a medium. Right? So you have to think, what does a playwright have available to him or her that's different from, say, what a novelist has available? So that, well, I can take a week to read Anna Karenina, I can take a month to read it, I can take a year to read it. Right? So that my time is my own. Right? I shape the temporal experience, sort of in many ways, of that novel. I mean, it has its own temporal experience, but in relation to my time, I'm in charge. In the theater, that's not the case. Sort of in the theater, you're there, and your time and the playwright's time and the play's time are largely sort of in sync. My first employer was a man named Lloyd Richards, a man who was the first black man ever to direct a play on Broadway, Raisin in the Sun, back in 1959. And in his opening speech to the Yale School of Drama, which he ran, he would say to the playwrights, listen, welcome, and here's the deal. A playwright is someone who takes you by the lapel and says, come with me, because for the next 2 hours, I have something more important for you to do than anything else you could be doing. Right? And he said, so if you think you're not up to that, could I ask you to drop out now? Because we'd rather give that scholarship to someone else. He was pointing to the temporal aspect of things, sort of among others, that sort of we are there in the grip of something, sort of over a defined period of time. So in the performing arts in general, sort of we find people making very specific demands on our time because time itself is one of the media. Right? So Athol Fugard, the great South African playwright, used to say, so what's available to me as a playwright? I have time, I have space, I have silence, and if I so choose, I have actors' bodies. And he says, but those are my media. And I work within those media. Fugard is another one, incidentally, that would pay great homage to Beckett. So Beckett really forced a recognition of the temporal in ways that playwrights had, seems to be never done before. Though many of the great playwrights do write plays in such a way as to remind us that time is the name of theater's game. What we refer to as plot, for example, is simply a matter of giving time a shape, sort of shaping it in a particular way. You may know that in the screenwriting business, supposedly, sort of when you send in a screenplay to sort of be read, they look at page 17, and they look at page 42, and they look at page 123, and certain kinds of things are supposed to be happening on those pages. Right? They don't even have to know what the plot is. They can tell whether the right kind of thing is happening, because they have an idea of how time is meant to be shaped, right, sort of in a film. And incidentally, their notion of how that's to be shaped is derived from 19th century playwriting practice. What was called the well-made play. That wasn't a way of saying something nice about a play, the well-made play. Oh, it's very well made. Right? It was actually a formula for making plays, and some of the French playwrights could turn out hundreds of plays. They had little work teams, and sort of, it's like a little bit like television writing, maybe. Sort of, to turn out sort of a play a month for sort of years on end. At any rate, so Beckett really, pointing us towards the subject of time and the medium of time in his theatrical pieces. My title is actually derived from a novelistic work of Beckett's, and you can sort of find two excerpts from that on this page. I'll maybe save the first of the quotations and go right to the one about time, which is the second quotation. And you might think about it in relation to the picture here, which is of a character named Winnie from Happy Days, who is, in the first act of that play, buried up to her waist in dirt, and in the second act, buried up to her neck in dirt. In the first act, she has her hands available. She has this parasol. She has a handbag, which you can see a bit out there. In the second act, of course, she doesn't have arms anymore to use, and so she can only talk. There's a related passage from the novel The Unnameable, which goes to the heart of Beckett's interest in time, I think. The question may be asked off the record, why time doesn't pass from you, why it piles up all around you, instant on all sides, deeper and deeper, thicker and thicker, your time, others' time, the time of the ancient dead and the dead yet unborn. I love that phrase. The dead yet unborn. Sort of, again, that's gallows humor. Sort of, an interesting way of thinking about the future. The dead yet unborn. Why it buries you grain by grain, neither dead nor alive, with no memory of anything, no hope of anything, no knowledge of anything, no history, no prospects, buried under the seconds, saying any old thing, your mouth full of sand. Oh, I know it's immaterial. Time is one thing, I another. But the question may be asked why time doesn't pass just like that, off the record, en passant, to pass the time. Here in this photograph, you'll see Beckett taking that paragraph and in a way visualizing it. Right? So if the paragraph at some level says, time buries you, right? And the one plot that we know that we are all enacting, right, is the plot that awaits us, right, in the graveyard at the end. Well, in this play, you see Winnie gradually go into the ground. Right? She worries about being sucked up, but it's obviously a compensatory thing because what she's really worried about is, of course, being sucked under. So sort of Beckett always drawing attention to the subject of time because in his plays, you don't have the traditional protagonist and antagonist of the well-made play, sort of many other kinds of plays. It's time always that's the antagonist. It's us against time. And when he directed Waiting for Godot in Germany, one of the first notes he gave to the actors is that silence keeps seeping into this play like water into a sinking ship. And Beckett's own production of Waiting for Godot lasted about an hour longer than any other production that I've ever seen. And that's because this is a play that famously uses the stage direction's pause quite a bit. You'll find pause in other playwrights. Chekhov used the thing pause. Silence. Chekhov used silence as well as the stage direction. And then long silence, right? And what Beckett had the actors do when a long silence was happening was pause. So no one, I mean, people in the theater are terrified of pauses and silences, right, as a rule. Because of course, there's the worry that the audience will get bored. Beckett thought that boredom was actually a rather interesting and important aspect of life, and you might want to incorporate it into the theater, right? There's the worry that the audience might think that the actor had forgotten a line, right? What silence sometimes means. And that's exactly what Beckett wanted, right? Since the whole idea was these two guys, Dee and Gogo, were, as it were, making it up as they went along, right? If in fact, at particular moments, they were not coming up with the line, that was an important aspect of the play itself, that improvisation occasionally breaks down. So it's a play that calls attention to our experience in time, especially time as embodied by silence, in ways in which we try to use various things to keep the silence and the ticking clock at bay. The title, I'm going to talk for maybe about 10 more minutes and then open up questions. The title, Waiting for Godot, people tend to pay too much attention to the Godot part. First of all, you'll hear how I'm saying it. That's the way Beckett said it, Godot. He didn't say Godot, he said Godot. And you think, oh, the theological resonance, right? Let me remind you, this play was written in French, where the word G-O-D has absolutely no theological resonance, right? So it gets theological resonance, for English speakers, right? Even if they're watching in French, if they know English, they think, oh, well, the English have this word for it, but in fact that's not in fact the French word. And when asked specifically by the first American director of his work, who is Godot? Beckett said, if I knew, I would have said so in the play. I would describe him as that thing that you look forward to, that were it to arrive, would answer all your questions. I teach undergraduates, so I say it's the yes from Princeton, it's admissions office. It's the yes from the Yale Law School's it's marriage, it's a good job at some investment banking firm, it's anything you think is going to solve all your problems and then learn that it doesn't. It's infinitely deferred. I think it was Norman Mailer who referred to Beckett's Waiting for Godot as an infinitely protracted Advent. But no Christmas. Godot does not arrive. Instead, a boy arrives, saying that surely Godot will come tomorrow. And that boy, very important to our sense of the play. We might well wonder why these guys are waiting for Godot. Might think about it as some kind of private fixation without that boy. So the emphasis is really, I think, meant to be on the waiting. Right? This is what do you do while waiting for Godot? And what we see these tramps do is play games together. They play games with their hats. They play a kind of falling down game. They play linguistic games. They play meaning games. And what might it all be actually be about? And all of these games are equally purposeful, right? To ask what is the meaning of life, and to play a hat game that you've borrowed from Laurel and Hardy, right? Both of those pass time, right? And that's the objective, right? And one of those things is not in the world of Beckett valued over the other. Right, indeed, what it's just as the way the play is written, meaning itself is, I think, being questioned, the value of meaning. Right? At one point, the tramps are getting a little tired of their conversation, and one of them says, "This is becoming really insignificant." To which the other replies, "Not enough." Which makes significance the enemy. Meaning the enemy. It's not that the world is meaningless, it's that there's too much fucking meaning in the world. Right? We're buried with meaning. Right? Buried with meanings from the Bible, buried with meanings from our childhood, buried with meanings from our teachers, buried with all these meanings. Right? And how do you ever get out from under this meaning and try to live some kind of vital life, the play might suggest. As I said, not much of a plot, nothing happens twice. But the fact is that the play is extraordinarily well structured. All right, Beckett was obsessed with structure. So I've seen the notebook in which he wrote this play, right? So it's like a schoolboy's notebook, right? And he begins in the first page of the notebook, and he's writing only on the right-hand side all the way through, right? And then he comes back and writes on the left-hand side, and the play ends on the page that the play began, and no pages have been torn out. So in other words, sort of the idea was, I'm filling this notebook. So that the length of this play is the length of this notebook. Sort of, there's a structure sort of just in that. Lots of structures related to circles in the play as well, lots of circularity. So as you know, the theater we think of as having lines. What's the arc of the play? What's my through line? Sort of, that kind of thing. Beckett got away from lines, so sort of certainly in this play more interested in circles. So we want the dialogue keeps on coming back to the lines, let's go, we can't. Why not? We're waiting for Godot. Odd. Right, so we keep on circling back to that, circling back to that. So you know there's something structural going on, right? Sort of, but it's not the usual linear structure, a more narrative kind of theater. There are symmetries, right? So we see two pairs of men. Right? There's Didi and Gogo, who I've been talking a lot about, but there's also Pazzo and Lucky. So two sets of men seen over the course of 2 days, plus a boy that comes in at the end of each act. So when you're watching it, you can feel the symmetry, you can feel the circularity, and even an occasional moment of sort of linearity, which makes you think that what you're seeing is not without art. It's not without form. It's just a different kind of form than you're used to in the theater. And then the pairs are distinguished from one another in terms of theatrical history. Didi and Gogo are borrowed from, as I said, Laurel and Hardy, Charlie Chaplin. Those were Beckett's favorite actors. Beckett had no time for psychological actors. Right? An actor who wanted to know a subtext wouldn't last long, sort of with Beckett. Beckett directed like a choreographer. Right? So he'd sort of say to the actors, okay, now you're going to sort of meet one another, and so you'll take a step with your sort of downstage leg, and then he'll take a step with his downstage leg, then right, then left, then left. Then on the count of 3, right, both of you will bring up your sort of downstage legs, and then on the count of 3 drop, right, after the embrace. Right, so he's not getting into what does it all mean. Right? Every now and again, just a little sort of phrase, but by and large, very technically oriented, as I am not. So Didi and Gogo are, as I say, from vaudeville, from music hall, improvisers. Pazzo and Lucky, on the other hand, their types are based in an art form called Commedia dell'arte. Right, sort of, so where there are hundreds of types, but one is called Il Capitano, the captain. Sort of in English, it's often translated as the braggart soldier, a guy who's long-winded and thinks a lot of himself and insists that everyone watch him while he talks. And then Lucky Il Dottore, the doctor, the learned doctor, as it's often translated into sort of English. These are very different ways of approaching character. Right, sort of, so all the characters are conceived differently, in different kinds of plays. And indeed, sort of, they seem to be related to different kinds of worlds. Didi and Gogo are sort of, the ones who are constants for us out there on stage. Pazzo and Lucky arrive once in the first act, once in the second. They come in, they leave. They stay for a while, they leave. And their world is a much more linear world. Right? So in the second act, Lucky has is now done, something that was not true in the first act, where he gave a very long speech indeed. And Pazzo is now blind. Right? And so now Didi and Gogo are the same. Right? Richard Schechner, I think, sort of once said, it's as if Didi and Gogo were on the soul's time, right? And Pazzo and Lucky were on the body's time. Right? Sort of, at 80, you're still asking, might well still be asking the same questions you were asking about what's it all mean, as you were. So when you're younger, on the other hand, the body that's doing the asking, different. right? And the difference is not entirely to the better. Maybe that's just a personal experience of mine. Beckett, thinking in pairs all the time. Two different kinds of ways to conceive characters. Two different two sets of characters. Two different acts that reflect one another. These are different shapes, right? And so everything about the play should be approached in terms of shapeliness. His great statement on the subject of shapeliness is on the biographical sheet, where he once opined, right? I am interested in the shape of ideas, even if I do not believe in them. There's a wonderful sentence in Augustine. I wish I could remember the Latin. It is finer in Latin than in English. Do not despair. One of the thieves was saved. Do not presume. One of the thieves was damned. That sentence has a wonderful shape. It is the shape that matters. Now, of course, that particular sentence is quite relevant to the play, since at one point Didi actually says, he's trying to tell the story of the two thieves. He says, one of the thieves was saved, and the other, and then the stage direction says, he tries to recall the opposite of saved, right? Then eventually he gets to it. One of the thieves was saved, and the other damned, right? And of course, the stage direction does what Derrida came along and did in philosophy much later. It deconstructs the idea. If there was still any validity in this world to the words saved and damned, you would not have to struggle to remember the opposite of the word saved. Right? But again and again in this, in this world, every time we try to go, on the one hand, but on the other hand, saved, damned, Beckett pulls the rug out from under us. Right? Again, that's one of the old-fashioned ways of making a narrative that he's not so interested in. When one of the characters has fallen down, right, they're trying to remember who that character is. And so he said, well, maybe his name is Cain. And so he goes up, Cain, and the character says, help! He's got it in one. So there's someone else down. He says, perhaps his name is Abel. And he goes, Abel! And the character really goes, help! So Jimmy looks and goes, he's all humanity. In more typical works of fiction, let's say William Faulkner, you know who the Cain characters are and who the Abel characters are. Right? And Beckett, we're all Cain characters and Abel characters. We're all saved and damned. Right? It's tragi-comedy, they're putting things together. Incidentally, one final comment on this Augustine line. This statement exists nowhere in Augustine, in Latin or in English. We don't know whether Beckett knew that or not. His mentor Joyce liked to play games like this. Maybe that Beckett was playing a game as well, but he was actually pointing us to something important in the game that he plays as a writer, which is about the shapes of ideas and the ways in which the shapes victimize us, the shapes torture us. These meanings that we brought into the world as human beings actually so often work to our disadvantage. So the action of the play is simply for the two trends to keep the ball rolling, using all the available games of meaning. Intellectual games, theological games, philosophical games, sociological games, psychological games, physical games, theatrical games, you name it. Play with the hats, fall down, do the tree, the yoga thing, whatever you want. All these games pass the time and are therefore efficacious to some degree, but only as a means of passing the time. That, of course, ultimately is the game that we lose. I'm going to cut to the end here simply because I'd like to take some questions. And so I'm going to pass over in a way the ending of the play, which it seems to me is all about our need for an ending. And so when you're watching a play that is circular, that is non-linear, that doesn't seem to have a climax or whatever, you're looking for, okay, so what did I pay my $100 for? And Beckett plays a lot of games at the end of his play with something that sums it all up. And then, as is usually the case, pulls that rug out from under us yet again. Simply because his game is, if you will, the ongoing game of interpretations. Make us work for what it is that we think it is without actually giving it to us. Let me end instead sort of by going back to the paragraph that gave me my title, which is from The Unnameable as well, and which you have in one of your handouts. And this is from the end of that novel. Sort of this end has become, I'd say, sort of close to kind of sentimental treasure of late 20th century sort of literature. I should point out that this is a novel that has no punctuation until the period, no period until the period that you'll find here at the end of the quotation. It's simply one long ramble. You must go on, I can't go on. You must go on, I'll go on. You must say the words as long as there are any, until they find me, until they say me. Strange pain, strange sin. You must go on. Perhaps it's done already. Perhaps they have said me already. Perhaps they have carried me to the threshold of my story. But before the door that opens my story, that would surprise me. If it opens, it will be I. It will be the silence where I am. I don't know. In the silence, you don't know. You must go on. I can't go on. I'll go on. Most people who quote sort of this passage for titles of talks and papers and books and sort of the like use both I can't go on and I'll go on. Sort of, because that seems to capture a kind of typical Beckettian binary. Right? I can't do it, I will. Right? So the last lines of Waiting for Godot, when you look at the script, are sort of, there's a line of dialogue that says, let's go. And then the stage direction, they do not move. So sort of same opposition as I can't go on, I'll go on. If I've chosen in my own title to focus on the I'll go on, it's simply because it seems to me that the comic dimension of Beckett's work is too often underestimated. And I commend to you once again this production in New York, where it is by no means underplayed. I assure you, it'll be an experience worth having. So happy to take any questions that you have. Yes?
Is there a significance as to why he wrote it in French?
He had been living in France for a very long period of time, right? So since sort of really the early 30s. Right, so, and he had spent, of course, the entire war in France, once memorably saying that he preferred France at war to Ireland at peace. He, of course, he lived, I mean, he was an Irishman in particularly interesting times in Ireland, especially if you were a Protestant, in what became the Republic. So he had a kind of ambivalent relation to Ireland. He was once asked by a French reporter, Monsieur, vous êtes anglais? Sir, you're English? To which he responded, au contraire. So quite the opposite, right? Sort of, it makes no sense. Right? What is that? Sort of, but sort of, it's actually, that's become a byword in Irish criticism, right? Sort of now that Irishness is a form of the opposite of Englishness, right? In the ways in which the two countries would only have a sense of themselves if they existed in relation to one another. He'd been living in France for a very long period. It was the language that he was living in. The language his wife spoke, so he and his wife spoke, sort of all that kind of thing. So that's part of it. But the other part has to do with something I alluded to earlier, which is his complicated relationship to the work of James Joyce. Right? So at one point he actually worked as a kind of a secretary to Joyce, or helped Joyce do some dictation of Finnegan's Wake. Joyce had very bad eyesight and sort of found it difficult. So Finnegan's Wake was dictated for the most part. He was in awe of Joyce, and with some good reason. But he had to try to figure out, well, what else could you do? Because Joyce was just so epic, sort of in what he was doing with the language, what he was doing with storytelling in Ulysses, and also in sort of Finnegan's Wake. And so there's this great moment in the late 30s where Beckett has this epiphany on the pier at Dunleary, just in the southern part of Dublin. And he realizes that what his project will be. And this is what he wrote about that moment. I realized that James Joyce had gone as far as one could in the direction of knowing more, being in control of one's material. He was always adding to it. You only have to look at his proofs to see that. I realized that my own way was in impoverishment, in lack of knowledge, and in taking away, in subtracting rather than adding. Okay? And so he realized that one of the ways that he could do that was not to write in his mother tongue. But the minute that he started writing in English, all this other stuff started rushing in. Right, sort of, a little, his mother, what his mother said to him when he was young, sort of, what was going on in Irish politics, what he'd learned in school, sort of all that kind of stuff. But French was a language that he had learned as an adult. And so he found that he could write, as he put it, more without style in French, right, sort of, than in English. And so for a long time he writes only in French first, translating into English. And then with Happy Days, I think that's the first of the works where he goes back and he writes again first in English. And we have the manuscript, and there are all these allusions to contemporary Irish, stuff in the original manuscript. And then you just see him go through and cross it all out, because he knows that that kind of stuff has no place in the work of Samuel Beckett, as he's now been created through the adoption of French. So, I mean, the short answer is I think he felt crowded out of English by Joyce, and French gave him another way. Oh, yes, sorry.
My introduction to Beckett was, of all places, in a music class, where after having studied all the people from the 19th and 20th century, we get to Beckett. And the poor professor is trying to explain, first of all, what the play is about, and secondly, what the music is about, and trying to convince us that what he's playing for us really is music. And so the question is, after having been made into an opera that I guess is occasionally played, was it ever made into a ballet? And do the people move?
It's not been made into a ballet to the best of my knowledge. And some of the shorter pieces have been set to music. But I don't think any of the longer pieces have. I think it was W.H. Auden who once heard about someone who was evidently going to try to do a musical or operatic version of the Importance of Being Earnest. And he said, that's redundant, it's music already. And I think that there's a musicality to sort of Beckett that could be difficult for even a great composer to come to terms with. As I tell my students, it's only bad plays that make good movies. And a really great play should be so tied to the theater that it is not easily, put into a different form. And by and large, I think that's true. But there must be something like that in music. Having said that, I can think about 177 exceptions, but never mind. A little jet lag. Anyone else? Yes?
Is it a difficult play for actors?
Yeah. So there are difficulties. All plays are difficult in a way, but there are particular difficulties, and having to do with some of the things I talked about, what's the line, a lot of the language that you learn when you're learning to act is based on a system that was developed in Russia at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, called the Stanislavski system, that was adopted in the United States and became known as the American method. Right, and it's about lines more than anything else, and subtext and that kind of thing. That stuff won't serve you extraordinarily well in relation to this kind of material. Right? So as I said, Beckett didn't like psychologically oriented actors. He liked Charlie Chaplin, he liked Laurel and Hardy. It's a different kind of psychology, but I don't think we'd ask Charlie Chaplin about his subtext, when he's doing cutting up the shoe. But that was the stuff Beckett loved. I mentioned that Beckett did one film called Film, and he wanted Charlie Chaplin to star in it, but Chaplin had retired by that point, so they got Buster Keaton. But those were the people that he loved, and the kinds of people that he saw as being right for his plays. So one of the hardest things for the actors is that there is not forward momentum. So I mentioned the way that you keep on coming around to, let's go, we can't, why not, we're waiting for Godot, right? So that comes around, I don't know, 14 times in the play, okay? And the difficulty is, which time is it, right? Because what I say next, sort of propels us into sort of the next scene. And there are 14 different things that I might say next after that little exchange, right? So when we did it with some undergraduates here, in actually the best production of the play that I've seen, in fact, the director said that they solved the problem by having the tramps do that exchange at a different place on the stage every time, so that they would physically be in a different place, even though the dialogue was the same. And then being in the physically different place would remind them what's the next beat, right? So but as a rule, that's not something you have to worry about in a play. I think also sort of there's people get sucked, I think this is an acting problem, people can get sucked into the sadness of it, and sort of forget the comedy. For a couple years ago, there was a production, maybe some of you saw it at Lincoln Center, and it starred Steve Martin and Robin Williams as Dee Dee and Go-Go, and the wonderful mime Bill Irwin played Lucky, and F. Murray Abraham played Pazzo. And everyone kind of, oh my God, what a cast, what a cast, what a cast. And everything that made that casting right, sort of the actors seem to have decided sort of was all wrong. And so you just sort of saw them all kind of going back to some early theater training that was about subtext and sort of this, and it was a kind of morbid affair. Not nearly as funny as it should have been. And sort of once in a while, sort of, some life emerged. And hysterically, sort of, one of the critics I remember took Robin Williams to task for improvising at a particular moment. And then he quoted what the improvisation was. And it's actually stuff from the text. And the text is meant to seem improvised, but sort of the critic had just sort of missed this. So at one point, right, they're going back and forth insulting one another. They're playing a game of insulting one another. And they keep topping one another, saying nasty things. And then sort of the nastiest comment at all, the one that ends the game, is one of them calls the other critic. And the critic thought that this was an improvisation, aimed presumably at him. In fact, it's there in the English text. If you look at the French text, the word is architect. And when Beckett was asked about it, he said, I think he was in Brussels, and so he saw two cabbies having a fight. One of them had cut off the other sort of in traffic or something. And sort of, they were calling each other sort of terrible names, and then finally one of them said architect, and the other was so offended he got in the cab and drove off. And it turns out it has to do with a particular building in, I think it's Brussels. It's when it was built in the 19th century, everyone hated the building so much, right, that architect became a word of abuse, right? And so in English, Beckett thought that word was critic, and not architect, but in French he was willing to stay with the French word. Someone else had yes?
Yeah. The whole theater of the absurd, Ionesco, and Ionesco actually, 1950, 52?
Yeah, same period right after the war.
Same period. Did they work together ever? Or?
So they were certainly aware of one another, so some of them knew each other. Theater of the Absurd was actually coined by a man that I knew, Martin Esslin.
Right.
And Martin was the man who was in charge of commissioning radio dramas for the BBC. And he was a Hungarian man originally, a refugee sort of from Europe in the war, and with just an extraordinary eye for talent. And so Beckett and Pinter and Ionesco, all these folks were on Esslin's payroll. And when they were making no money from anything else, they were making money writing these radio dramas. So they were a cohort. They were of a generation, that post-war generation. There's something very post-war about production in New York. I don't want to talk about it too much, but it tries to situate it within that world, right? So, for example, the names in these plays. So, Dee Dee Go-Go, actually in the text are called Vladimir and Estragon, and then Pozzo and Lucky, right? So 4 names that are not related to the same language group. Those are 4 different language groups. Estragon is an old French thing. Kind of slightly weird choice. But at any rate, sort of, that in some ways probably reflects on that refugee reality, right, after the war, where you have a lot of displaced people. And sort of, these characters are in some ways, in fact, displaced. And that's true of a lot of the other plays that people were writing about at the time. You notice that I didn't actually use the term theater of the absurd, sort of here, because as Martin himself, explains, I think even in the book, he said, listen, there's something going on, and we're just trying to get hold of it. So you remember I started with that anecdote about Algernon saying they couldn't figure out a vocabulary. And so Estlin hit upon the term absurd, right, in relation to an essay of Camus, most especially, and used that as a kind of umbrella term for a bunch of writers that I think nowadays we think don't actually have that much in common. It was really important at the time to have that label, but sort of it's a label that doesn't get used so much anymore, because now we think, God, Pinter and Beckett, now they were literally in dialogue with one another. Pinter sent his plays, some of his plays to Beckett for comment, right? In the way that later on, David Mamet sent his plays to Pinter. David Mamet famously sent his play, which one is it? Glengarry Glen Ross, right? Sent that to Pinter, and Pinter for comment. And Pinter's response was to walk it over to the National Theatre and say, do this play now. And so the first production of that play actually happened in England. Pinter actually returned, there was a kind of return, Mamet sent Pinter the play Oleana. And Pinter said, oh, this is quite interesting, I'd like to direct it. And so they arranged for that to happen. And then Mamet sent the rewrite, right? And Pinter said, no, sorry, no, I'm doing the play you sent originally. I'm not doing the rewrite. And Mamet said, you can't do that. You have to do what I say you'll do. He said, well, you can get another director, but the fact is you've messed up your play. And he said, it's that stupid sort of masculinist politics of yours that's getting in the way of what was once a good story. And sort of, I'm sorry you've ruined it for the American audiences, but I'm not going to ruin it for the British ones. So it's a small world. It's a craft guild. And you tend to be aware of and sometimes know the other people that are working sort of in the guild. We used to say, 6 degrees of separation in the theater, you'd never have to do 6 degrees. It's usually 1, and so possibly 2. Yes?
I think Edward Albee said that his, Zeus story opened for Beckett, prior to Beckett in Berlin. Any thoughts on Albee and Beckett?
Yeah, well, actually the recent collected volumes of Beckett actually have an introduction by Edward Albee. And so yes, I think that which one was it? I think it was the Zoo Story was on a double bill with one of the Beckett plays when it was first done. That was a play that was first done in Berlin rather than the United States. Albee was having trouble finding a producer here. And then, again, sort of in the late 50s, early 60s, they were grouped together. Albee was more of a quote-unquote absurdist in those days. I think that many of his best plays are actually more rooted in American realism or an interesting wedding of American realism and sort of Beckettian theatricality. But again, Edward Albee is not. This is on tape, isn't it? Never mind. Okay, so let's just say that Edward Albee goes to great length at the drop of a hat to talk about his admiration for Beckett. I don't think there's any writer that he feels is better. And I think also a very important influence on his work. The games, think of the games and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It's like, I think those, playing Get the Guests and Hump the Hostess and the various games there, I think are, rooted in the games that get played in Cado. Same thing with Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. I remember a student once came up to me after a lecture on Godot that I gave and said, what constitutes plagiarism in the theater? And I said, well, same thing as I think anywhere else. And he said, well, like, didn't Tom Stoppard rip this guy off? And I said, well, I think the way they talk about it in Hollywood is Waiting for Godot meets Hamlet. Because that's, and Stoppard was the first to say so, sort of that Beckett had a huge influence on the early work. And in one of his later plays, Jumpers, right, so there's a very long speech that alludes to a very memorable speech from Waiting for Godot. And the last line of that speech is, wham, bam, thank you, Sam. Right? And there's a Sam within the world of the play, but that's, I think, not the Sam that's being thanked at this particular moment.